This is Ayanni,
And this is Corinne.
and you're listening to Sex, Love, Literature, a pop culture podcast.
On this episode, we'll be talking about The Great, the Hulu original show. It is a very farcical retelling of Catherine the Great's rise to power. In its intro, it says it's an occasionally true story, and they do mean very occasionally.
Very, very occasionally. Okay, so thank you all for joining us with our first episode ever of Sex, Love, Literature. My name is Ayanni Cooper, and I am going to be one of your hosts for this adventure in podcasting. To tell you a little bit about me, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Florida in the English department. I study comics and animation, and my dissertation looks at monsters and desire. So part of the reason I wanted to do sex, love, literature is I have an interest in how desire manifests in pop culture. Yeah. Oh, and I love cats. So there will be lots of conversation about cats constantly all the time. Yeah. So Corinne, who are you?
I am also a PhD candidate at the University of Florida in the English department. However, I specialize in children's and young adult literature, and my dissertation is on consent in young adult speculative fiction. But since I'm thinking about consent for my dissertation, I then am thinking about consent and sex and power and gender in everything that I watch or read.
All the time, constantly.
All of the time, constantly. I also am happy to talk about cats, but I am allergic to them, so my contributions are generally not very helpful.
No, I appreciate it. Anyone that'll listen to me talk about cats for a long period of time is always welcome. So yeah, I guess we should tell the folks a little bit about what sex, love, literature is, and then we can launch into our conversation of the only occasionally true The Great. So yeah, sex, love, literature. How would you describe what we're doing with this podcast, Corinne?
So I think the reason we wanted to talk specifically about sex and love in literature, thinking about literature defined very broadly, is because a lot of the time you can see how you can see how a lot of larger themes like power, like gender relations, like characterization, a lot of those things can be sort of distilled and sort of almost crystallized when you think specifically about sex and love and lust and everything to do with that in pop culture. It's also interesting to think about the way sex is viewed and portrayed in different mediums depending on who the intended audience is.
Absolutely.
For example, since I study children's literature, you might think that it's always very vanilla, and that's not necessarily true.
No, yeah, that's excellent. I mean, I know for me, one of the things I think about a lot is how sex, lust, romance is actually depicted. Like, what are we looking at? What are we as viewers, as audiences focusing on when we're watching these kinds of romantic scenes? What kind of feelings are they supposed to be evoking in us? So yeah, I was kind of laughing when we were thinking about doing this podcast, like, wow, we are such sex nerds. It's like, we want to talk about sex, but but we have to make it nerdy and academic, apparently. But yeah, no, I think that sums it up excellently. So what we're going to be doing over the course of our episodes, if we don't get sick of doing this after one episode, is looking at different pop culture, not to be snooty, but lowercase L literature. We don't play the high culture, low culture game. That's not our bag here. But really think about how sex, love, lust, romance is depicted across mediums, across genres. And of course, we'll probably fangirl a little bit, maybe a lot of bit, because we're watching things that we like. There might be some episodes where it's like, oh, we hate this, and we're going to tell you why. But that's not where we're starting. No, we are going to start with The Great, as Corinne said, a miniseries that's, I guess, debuted 2020, May?
May
On
2020, mid-pandemic.
mid-pandemic. Oh goodness. Now you've got me thinking about
Ugh.
everything that's happening. It's okay. But yeah, so mid-pandemic, it was a great pandemic watch. Um, 10 episodes. They all, I think, debuted at the same time, all released at the same time. So,
Mm-hmm.
made for binging, as it were. And the series is starring Elle Fanning as Catherine the Great, and Nicholas Holt as Peter the Third of Russia. Bum, bum, bum. So this was a show that Corinne put me onto. So for our glorious first episode, I figured let her have the reins. To kind of get us started on this conversation about the great.
So I think a good place to start actually would be thinking about Catherine's relationship to sex
Ooh.
and how it's almost used in the opening episode. So it's useful to think about Catherine's relationship to sex, both as the show begins and as it ends, and how it's
Mm.
used almost as like a gauge on her maturity and how ready she is to actually like rule Russia. So like the way we're
Oh, that's
introduced to
interesting.
her, she has this super naive romantic view of Peter, of sex, of being the Empress of Russia. And like,
Hmm.
so one of the, I think, almost like definitive moments of like early Catherine is this long monologue that she has about what sex is like.
Sorry. So one of my favorite things about that monologue was at the end when you weep occasionally with ecstatic joy. And then she squeaks when she says, and then you fall asleep in each other's arms. It
Yep.
was,
Yep.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. Continue. You were making a great analysis, and then I just burst out laughing in the middle.
Well, I mean, that's like a definitive moment for like audiences to know like Catherine is about to be very disappointed.
Oh, that is very true. And then Muriel, or not Muriel, excuse me, Mariel, acts as a foil in that sequence.
Mm-hmm.
Mariel
Almost
is,
even an audience surrogate in that particular
yeah,
moment.
no, that's an excellent point. Because she tries to set Catherine up, saying, do you know what's about to happen? And Catherine's all, I'm not as naive as you think, my dear, and then is just as naive as everyone.
Well, she's just as naive, but almost naive in a different way. Like, not that she
Mm,
doesn't know what sex is at all, which
right,
like
right, right, right.
you maybe could have thought about with like Archie checking her virginity. But
Uh,
like instead she has this overly romantic like
mm.
she has the facts, but she's put this like veneer on them that almost makes them not factual anymore.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's almost like not to look down on romance novels at all, but almost like a sheen of romance, right?
Oh my
Oh,
god. That's totally true, but like the way she uses metaphors to talk about sex, that like when you know it, she's
mm.
talking about like she means like orgasm and
Mm-hmm,
penetration and
mm-hmm.
all the like clinical terms, but like the way she uses the metaphors, like you look up into a starry sky with the brightest stars or whatever.
And then
It
you gently drift back down.
well like it reminds me of the way sex can be described in YA,
Oh,
where
do tell.
they're not they're it's so flat, like particularly in some books by Cassandra Clare I'm thinking of, where like
Mm.
the way she describes it is so flowery that like it's not really clear whether they actually had sex or not.
That's really interesting to think about. Especially in conversation with this kind of opening sequence, because on one hand, Catherine gives us this very kind of ethereal monologue about, the sky and the birds and the trees and all of the wonder that is sex, and then the next thing we know, Peter comes in, and it's a, kind of a cruel grounding, you
Well,
know?
it's almost like I don't even know that. So Peter's obviously a sociopath. He's totally well, I wouldn't even say he's devoid of feeling, but he's so centered on his own feelings that he doesn't care about
Mm-hmm.
other feelings. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not
Mm-hmm.
even cruel so much as it is just like cursory.
Mm. What do you mean by that?
Like it's his job to make an heir with
Ah,
Catherine.
okay.
So
So that's what
so
he's going to go
so
ahead
they
and do.
so he consummates their marriage and doesn't even like really interrupt his conversation with Grigor.
About the ducks.
Hmm.
So, not to transition away from this too quickly, but that makes me think of how in so many of these sex scenes in The Great, people are watching. There's a lot of,
There's no privacy.
yeah, there's a lot of
There's not
accidental,
locks on
incidental.
doors.
No,
There's
no. Yeah, and there's a lot of people who don't necessarily want to be there watching, standing by and watching because they're not sure if they should leave or not.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, a lot of accidental, incidental voyeurism that happens throughout The Great. Uh, Also, as a note, I know we mentioned that this was, uh, as it says on the title card, or not hashtag, asterisk, an occasionally true story. But if you are
Mhm.
curious about the history of Catherine the Great, this is not a good show to watch.
No.
Definitely go read an article online, or check out a book or something like that. So sorry, I was just thinking about the fact that Grigor was watching them having sex, and
Well,
train
and
of thought connections.
there's also I think the question of like watching versus listening.
Mm. In what
Um
way?
well, cuz like Gregor isn't watching. He's like behind a door or like on the other side of a door, so he could
In the
have a
door
line of
frame.
sight, but he's like looking the other direction. And like it's
Mm.
not I don't know, like then there's yeah, I'm not sure where I'm going with that.
No, that's okay. Yeah, it's almost like he's trying to give them a monicum of privacy by turning away, or perhaps he is understanding of the fact that it's a weird situation, but he has to act like it's completely normal because of his relationship with Peter.
This might actually be a good moment to then think about Grigor's relationship with Peter
Oof.
and Peter's relationship with Grigor's wife, George.
George. Oof. Oof. Okay. We are like zipping through things, by the way. It's like there's so much to talk about with this, that like, but what about this? Let's talk about this. Let's talk about this. But okay.
Hmm.
So was there anything in particular about Gregor's relationship with Peter that jumped out at you?
So I think one of the things to first think about is the way that viewers are introduced to
Mm,
Peter, George, and Grigor's weird love triangle is like
yeah.
through Catherine in her romantic naivete, trying to love Peter and make Peter love her, like showing up in Peter's bedroom to try and like seduce
Mm.
him,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
finding George already in his bed, but also Grigor is in the bedroom.
Yeah. He's in a chair, right?
Yeah, he's in a
Facing in the
chair
direction.
facing the other way.
Mm, mm-hmm,
There's
mm-hmm.
almost like there's a pattern here of Grigor like knowing Peter like sucks but looking the other way.
Yeah, 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 yeah. It's funny, there's a lot of sequences now that you mention that where he's kind of facing away from Peter's gaze, and not trying to almost disassociate from what's happening in the room,
Mhm.
which kind of explains some of what happens a little later in the narrative itself.
Mhm.
Um, Funny, that actually has me thinking, and I wonder if we're zooming through things too fast, but it's fine. Um, about the role of the audience and kind of the fact that we're voyeurs almost in watching
Mhm.
this. Um, I had talked to you about this before, but in a way, I was kind of thinking about the Great, almost like a sex farce in a way, right? We're watching
Mhm.
all of these different people move through different bedrooms, right, and having different relationships, sometimes with each other, sometimes with people who only appear for an episode and then disappear, you know. But we are watching it all. There was actually a sequence I was rewatching, in which my spouse called from upstairs and was like, "Are you watching porn?" And I was like, "I wouldn't, not on the big TV, no." Like, So there's this kind of interesting dynamic of like us as viewers watching all of these different kinds of sexual liaisons that are happening.
Well, there's a really interesting behind the scenes picture that I saw of when
Ooh.
like one of the many times where Peter and Catherine are having sex,
Mm,
but not. But like in the way where like Peter is standing on the edge of the bed, Catherine is like on her back with her legs up. But
yeah.
like in this behind the scene picture, like Catherine, like Elle Fanning is holding the camera,
Oh.
so like we see Peter from her perspective, like standing over her. So like we're both voyeurs, but we're also in a way Catherine.
Mm, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, though thinking about camera work, um, something I was thinking on is how those scenes with Peter are shot. With Catherine with her legs up
Mm-hmm.
and Peter on the edge of the bed, versus how love sequences are between Catherine and her lover Leo,
Mm-hmm.
which
Who we should
they're
talk about
just,
in more detail.
oh, of course, yeah, we're just so excited. Well, I mean, do you want to talk about Leo in a little bit more detail since we're
Oh,
here?
so yeah, for those of you who maybe haven't watched The Great yet, although
Wow, wow.
spoilers abound.
Yeah, right. We're a little late. We'll do better with the spoiler alerts next time.
Uh, Leo is Catherine. Leo is the lover that Peter gives to Catherine, and Leo is sterile, which is important for the succession. But also, like, Peter is not in the beginning, before he starts to think of Catherine as a person who he cares about.
Mm,
Um, but also the way that when Peter cares about something, he wants to own it. But before
mm.
Catherine is something he wants to be his, he gives her a lover named Leo, who Catherine is initially very, very skeptical of, but who she decides to have sex with pretty quickly. But yeah, thinking about the way that their scenes, so yeah, thinking about the way their scenes are shot versus the way that Catherine and Peter's scenes are shot. Go ahead.
Mhm. Oh, no, it was just the first time they have sex, if I recall correctly. There's a lot of camera movement, and a lot of looking at the two of them together in the shot rather than just focusing on Catherine or focusing on Leo specifically.
Well, and they're also both like active participants, whereas like with
Mhm,
Peter and
mhm.
Catherine, it's like Peter is doing something to Catherine and she is
Right,
enduring.
right. Enduring is a great word for what's happening there. Um, yeah. Oh, um, sorry. I was just so since we already got the spoiler banner out of the way, right? In episode 2, when Catherine decides that she is going to grin and bear it, right? Literally grin and bear it. Um, Also, a bad pun on bear for Russia, but
Oof.
well, we can just bypass that. We'll just go past that.
And for bearing an heir.
Oh, I'm terrible. I'm fired from the podcast. This is episode 1. You need to find a new co-host because I'm terrible. But yes, I'm not. Oh, so while she grins and bears it, but there's a sequence where she and Peter have. I don't even want to call it having sex, but
Intercourse.
intercourse. They're intercoursing, which is not a word, but I say it's a word. They are intercoursing, and she has this kind of plastered on, almost uncanny grin
Mm-hmm.
where she looks up at him. That is disquieting, perhaps, to say the
Mm-hmm.
least.
Well, and it freaks Peter out.
Yeah, he does show. What exactly is it that he does? Doesn't he like just say, "Oh, all right, well, indeed, huzzah," and leaves or something? But yeah, he's definitely unnerved in that circumstance, in that
Mm-hmm.
moment. But if we're thinking about active participants, right, and thinking about the different ways perhaps Catherine is depicted when she's having these kinds of
Mm-hmm.
liaisons.
Well, and that
Um,
active participants also, I think, correlates to like who has power, who has
mm,
agency, who is
mm,
pretending to have power or has power through. who they
Mm,
have
mm.
sex with. But go
Yeah.
on.
No. You just did an eyebrow raise thing. So I want to know if there was something particular
Oh,
you were thinking
I
about.
was thinking about George and how Georgie gets power through sleeping with Peter.
Mm,
And
yeah.
particularly how, like, in the second episode, um, after when Catherine is like still, I mean, part of it is when Peter thinks about having Catherine killed. Part of it is
Hmm.
because she makes him feel so unsettled and she's so unhappy. But like one of the things she does is be like, "Oh, well, like you're not Peter the Great, though." Like while
Mm.
they're having sex or while they're having intercourse, and then Peter immediately like goes and has sex with Georgie in public, like just on the other side of like a
Right.
door
Hmm.
while there's like a party going on. Like, and they have sex like very loudly, and like George having like a really loud orgasm or pretending
Hmm.
to.
I think it was pretend, but that's just me.
Well, but it reestablishes Peter's sort of like confidence in his masculinity. But then it's also interesting
Mm.
that part of his view of himself is dependent upon being able to give women pleasure and to
Hmm.
be good at sex.
Yeah. And that comes up multiple times. The
Mm-hmm.
different women that he's slept with, and that they keep coming back for it when they're in court or they return to town or what have
Well,
you.
and that like he thinks that part of the reason he's a popular leader is because he says because of his gigantic cock.
I'll believe you if you remember that quote better than I do.
Well, because he's like, yeah, I turned court into like an endless buffet, and women love me because of my giant cock.
Yeah. So you're right. There is this kind of priding himself on his ability to have sex and to provide pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, providing pleasure, I think, is, or you know what, I'm going to throw quotes around that. So scare quotes around providing pleasure. But this is
Mm-hmm.
something that this characterization of Peter strives to do. He wants people to love him, and he wants people to love him because life is a party, which is why some of the later episodes go so poorly for
Mm-hmm.
him, you know? Um, yeah, so I
Well,
think that's a really brilliant deduction, my
that's
dear
also
Corinne.
useful, I think, for thinking about love and like Peter
Mm,
loves being loved,
yeah,
and if people don't love him, he doesn't know who he is as a person
mm,
or as an emperor.
yeah. Oh, okay. So that's gonna make me want to jump all the way to the last episode.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh my God. That last. Just can we take a moment to appreciate Elle Fanning and Nicholas Holt's tour de force of acting in their last scene together?
so we can take more than a moment if you want, because I will say one of the things that I really liked about the show is how well acted it was.
Hmm.
They really found a great cast of people to put together who play off of each other
Hmm.
very, very well. Also, in doing my little bit of Wikipedia ing, which is also not a word, but we're gonna rock with it. Doing my little bit of Wikipedia ing before we jumped on, they've acted together before, actually. Uh,
Oh
they were
yeah.
in a film together, that the name of which I do not recall right now because Wikipedia is not open in front of me. But that kind of, I wonder if they had kind of a familiarity with each other and how they act before
Hmm.
coming into working on the Great, because they definitely played off of each other very, 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 very well. But I think the cast on whole was pretty fantastic.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Especially since there were so many, I don't want to say subtle character arcs because I feel like that's doing too much. But the way a lot of the characters evolved and changed from our first meeting with
Hmm.
them in episode 1 to where we leave them off in episode 10.
Yeah.
Uh
I don't think that I would describe any of the characters as static or like the
yeah.
main ones. Like maybe like Lady Svenska, because like who cares about Lady Svenska? But
The Catherine did.
that's true. Well, even Lady Svenska evolved in like how she thought about Catherine.
That is true. Even as a side character. I think the only character that perhaps we learned more about under the surface, but not necessarily evolved for me was Archie, the Archbishop. he
That's
kind of held pretty steady, and we learned more about him
mhm.
as a character, but he doesn't feel super different from episode 1 to episode 10 for me.
Yeah, it's more like we were uncovering layers for him
Yeah.
more than that he was like gaining new layers.
Yeah. Which, I mean, is worthwhile, but
Mhm.
a worthy distinction. But anyhow, back to episode 10 and their last interaction with each other.
Whew, oh my
Which
goodness.
so good. So good. So good. But one of the things that stood out to me in that sequence was Peter asking, "Why don't you love me?" Right? This
Mhm.
woman literally tried to stab him to death and is trying to take over his kingdom. And it's not, "Why are you doing this?" It's not, "How dare you? I'm angry," right? It's, "Why don't you love me?" So this kind of need to be loved and loved by those things, those people that he wants to, as you were saying, own and have.
Mhm.
Um, which felt very telling to me in that sequence.
Well, and I think also the thing that sort of blows my mind about how smart this show is that Catherine's response is like, I do, in a
In
way.
a way. Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think she does in a way. Like she has like, and like a lot of her relationship with Peter is very, I mean, it's very, very performative. Like
Mm.
performing what she thinks Peter will like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
with her as
Mm-hmm.
Empress when she's trying to
Mm-hmm.
like get him to like art and get him to like science. And also the moment when he like goes down, like before he goes down on her and he's like, oh, like I have a gift for you too. And then he's like, lift up your skirts. And she's like, oh, that gift.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. All right.
But like she has, I think, come to love and appreciate some things about Peter. And one of the things that, so I watched this show, I went back and rewatched it before we recorded this. And watching Peter start to legitimately love Catherine in
Mm.
whatever like fucked up way Peter can actually love things is so fascinating. And like as a viewer, I almost get, I think partly because Nicholas Holt is just so like lovable.
I
It's
mean, he is definitely your type. He fits in that box, I would think. It was funny. I was looking at pictures of him the other day, and I was like, yeah, Corinne would like this.
yeah. Well, he's just so confident, and even when he's cruel, it's more like, oh, like I'm the emperor, I can do this. It's not that like he's hurting people specifically to hurt people. It's just because it's like
Mm.
casual cruelty. Like it's
Which,
not masochistic, maybe is what I'm trying to say.
is it? I mean,
I mean, feel free to prove me wrong.
no. I'm just
I mean,
thinking,
it's always selfish.
yeah, but I guess the question becomes, is he getting pleasure out of the cruelty? And at times, I think he is. I think it's depending on who he's being cruel to
Yeah,
and
that's
the outcome of that cruelty, right? Because so when he does the whole torture thing, which was a lot, I closed my eyes a lot that episode. Didn't want to watch people's fingernails get
that's an
taken out.
episode that really, really grew on me, I think.
I believe you, but also now I'm wondering about you a little bit, in which the torture episode grew on you. But so, for example, when he plucked the eyes out of the heads, I think
Ugh.
that was what, like episode 2, maybe.
Yeah.
There was a glee in that kind of cruelty,
Oh,
right?
it was almost playful.
Which to me seems masochistic,
That's
right?
true.
If there's this kind of playful delight in the fact that he's taking eyeballs out of dead heads, I mean,
Like
that's a lot.
it was a jape.
It was just a jape. It was just a jape. Oh gosh.
But also like I mean it was gross and like very graphic, but also like
Yeah.
they were already dead.
Are you trying to? Are you a Peter apologist right now?
Yes,
On this very first podcast of
I am
ours?
a Peter apologist. He's just so
How dare.
interesting.
How dare? No, I agree. I do think the characterization is very, very interesting, if not completely made up, but very, very interesting.
Well, and I think
Um,
maybe then so what something I think it's important to also think about we talked about this show briefly with Dr. Ulanovich, who's on both of our committees, and something
She's
she
my
was,
advisor.
she's one of my committee members.
We love her.
But one of the things she was concerned about when she was only 2 episodes in was the way that this show depicts a Western idea of Eastern Europe as like fucking bonkers.
Which is totally worth thinking about and paying attention to, especially since I know this is something that you think about often too in your work and your research is depictions of Eastern Europe, and how these different kind of depictions play against each other or how they play into specific kinds of stereotypes. And that's definitely worth thinking about because The Great is what? Is The Great an American show or is The Great a Canadian show?
I think The Great is an American show.
Yeah, it's American.
Almost entirely, not completely, but a fairly British cast.
Okay.
Which then, so something that I was thinking about, because Tony McNamara, who wrote the script and was like a producer, who like did a lot of the like creating work for this show, which I think it should also be noted was based on a play. That he wrote. And
teaching me things.
But like this season is basically the first half of the play.
And
it ends at like intermission.
Okay.
But Tony McNamara also did The Favorite. And I haven't seen The Favorite, and I clearly need to. And Nicholas Hoult is also in The Favorite.
Yeah.
But The Favorite is parodying, I think, a specifically British, like, period kind of piece. And there are so many British period pieces with, like, Jane Austen movies, Dickens, like your stereotypical BBC miniseries. Like, that it is specifically parodying. So, like, when it's crazy, like, it has this whole other body of work to balance it. Where, and, like, The Great, which from what I've heard has a very, very similar tone to The Favorite, doesn't have an equally serious body of work that takes Eastern Europe seriously to help balance the satire and, like, the farcical nature of it.
From a Western perspective,
yeah,
I guess, is important to note.
From an American specifically, I think, perspective.
No, that's a really good point, and something that I guess I'd have to do some digging on, because even if we think about recent television, we have like The Americans, right? Which is serious, but then is a spy drama. It's not the same kind of a thing.
Well, and it still has like the Soviet Union as the bad guys. But I mean, that's also doing complicated things with like who you're supposed to side with, but.
Right, and who you're supposed to be paying attention to. I also haven't watched that, so I shouldn't really talk about it because
I'm a little bit obsessed with The Americans too. So.
Oh, well, there we go. Maybe we'll end up talking about The Americans at some point.
Although
down the line.
We should. The way that they think about sex is so interesting, like, because they're spies and they like use honey traps.
So one interesting fact about Corinne is that in a past life she was a spy.
Yes, this is true. This is canon.
So, yeah, anything having to do with spies, Corinne is all about it. Where were we going with this?
I mean,
we just
bringing it back to The Great, I think, like, with the way that, so it's satire. Like, we don't know. I think it's important that, like, it's not taking Catherine the Great's historical reality seriously,
right,
which I think lands differently.
Nor accurately.
It lands differently if you do or do not already know about and respect Catherine as a significant historical figure.
No, that's very true. And this is something that you and I have talked about previously, but thinking about how historical figures, and this, I hope this doesn't sound stupid, but they're complex, right? Just because someone has done some great things doesn't mean they also haven't done some terrible things.
Yeah.
And because this is a comedy, because it is, I think, farcical, there is not necessarily a focus so much on the negative aspects of Catherine's reign, which I know I've seen some critiques of, right? That this is very much like Catherine is bringing in the smarts. She's bringing in the arts and the sciences, and she loves Leo.
That's definitely true, but I also think the show has a kind of nuanced view of this version of Catherine. I think there is a nuanced, like, Catherine isn't unequivocally good. Like, when
Yeah.
she brings macarons to the front, it's ridiculous to see
Right.
her, and she realizes that it's ridiculous, but she doesn't really change much after that. And like
Yeah.
she does become less naive. She becomes a little bit more jaded. But even when she decides to like finally overthrow Peter, she's like, it's my birthday and I want Russia for my birthday, so we're doing this. So she's still selfish. And so something that Glenn Weldon said on NPR's Pop Culture Happy Hour is that it's not that, or not just that Catherine wants to do good, it's that she wants to be seen doing good.
Yeah. And she's definitely got a little bit of a savior complex going on too. You know, she's the one that's going to save Russia. And it is her destiny and her right, as you were saying, and her birthright, et cetera, et cetera.
Which, like, she's not even, like, Peter's right. She's not even fucking Russian.
I mean, she's not, but in her heart is Russian. Doesn't she say that at some point?
She says it many times.
Yeah. I mean, even in her kind of opening early monologue, she talks about a dream where she was embraced by a bear, and she knew that it would be her great love, and which, of course, is emblematic throughout the series for Russia. Russia is the bear, right? Yeah, so she's not a perfect character, but also very, very interesting.
Well, and that kind of, thinking about Catherine's love for Russia. So the way that Catherine wants to be empress is she wants to love Russia, and she wants that to be her great love. Peter wants Russia to love him.
So we kind of have Russia here as almost, I mean, you know, the city, the country as character, right? We have Russia here that is the nexus for the love of these two different leaders. It's funny. It's almost like we couldn't have picked a better show to talk about at first, because love is what unites and brings apart all of these characters throughout the series. So thinking about, again, going back to that very tumultuous final episode when Catherine is kissing Leo goodbye, right?
Oh, my heart.
And yeah, yeah, I had a lot of feelings. He says that his destiny was her, loving her, but that her destiny was loving Russia. So there's even this thought about the incompatibilities of love, almost, or unrequited loves.
It's the difficulties of balancing the personal and the political when you're in a position of power.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like, not to talk about your research for you, right? But in a lot of the fantasy novels you write about, you're thinking about these people who are in positions of power and how they navigate relationships, both with people who are more powerful than them, and then also people who are, I guess, less powerful, just to use the same phrase.
And maybe building on that, it is only when Catherine starts to become more powerful that she becomes attractive to Peter.
Oh, interesting. Where would you pinpoint that?
So definitely a moment where Peter sort of flip, like an obvious moment when he flips is after Grigori's assassination attempt.
Sorry.
His like very poorly thought out assassination attempt.
I mean, sometimes you just gotta like put paint in your friend's borscht, like, you know.
That is so
normal, right? That's normal.
Man. Side note, so I lived in Poland for a year, and the pretend name of my book, if I ever were to write about living in Poland, would be Instant Borscht.
Is that a thing?
Yes.
Oh, we're gonna have to talk about that another time.
But like that it's specifically that he poisoned the borscht.
Yeah. Oh, and poor Louis, like the chef.
Yeah, poor Chef Louis.
The food was never the same after that.
But the way that Peter flips to like wanting his life to have more meaning besides like a big party and lots of sex, he like is, I think, open to influences, and Catherine is well positioned because, especially because, oh God, we have to talk about Anne Elizabeth and her like
Oh,
pushing Peter to produce an heir. But
yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
but Catherine is well positioned when Peter is looking for new inspiration to give
Mm.
him that inspiration.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And when she keeps giving him these ideas that like start to work out, and then like don't always work out the way that Peter thought they would, because they
Mm.
reveal how much he is in fact not as loved as he had
Loved. Right.
hoped.
Mm-hmm.
But he starts to listen to her as someone who has something to say.
Right, right. Not just the woman that he needs to produce an heir with.
Yeah.
So, not to cut off your Peter discussion, but you mentioned Aunt Elizabeth, and we have not had a chance to talk about her.
She's my favorite
and
character. I don't know how she hasn't come up yet.
yeah, I don't, because there's just so much in the great. There's so much. She trains butterflies.
Badly.
Amazing.
And doesn't she like eat one once?
That was an accident.
But
yeah,
just this image of like Aunt Elizabeth floating around in a cloud of butterflies is like amazing.
Yeah, yeah. I kind of want that for myself. I wish I could float around in a cloud of butterflies. That'd be awesome, actually. Next life, I want a cloud of butterflies. Put that out there. But something actually that jumped out at me about Anne Elizabeth, besides her butterflies and her fantastically coiffed hair, so we skirted around this, but the cunnilingus sequence. Oh God, why am I using the technical term cunnilingus? It's because we're sex nerds. When Peter goes down on Catherine in episode 7, he learned that move from Aunt Elizabeth, and I think there's an interesting kind of conversation to be had about the kind of sexual energy that Aunt Elizabeth brings into the narrative, and how she's kind of touching all of the main cast. Touching, another bad pun. But she's really touching all of the main cast with both her sexual knowledge and, you know, her opinions, her advice about sex and relationships.
Well,
you know,
and the way that so like as Peter's aunt, she can control Peter more effectively when she chooses to than anyone else in the whole court. By like imitating his mother, by like telling him stories about his parents, by like being like, Catherine's unhappy, like you gotta do something about it, buddy.
Right, you gotta fix that.
Like she's really, really influential, but like in a way that like Peter accepts.
Yeah. No, I thought there was more to that sentence.
I did too. I'm just trying to decide where to go from that. But like at the same time, she's this voice of reason and sort of like has a steady hand and is steadying to Peter. But at the same time, she is like a force of chaos. Like she'll sleep with anyone. I mean, not just anyone, but like she does want some sort of. I think she cares more about consent than like Peter does.
Right.
Is she like she'll sleep with women? So we were also something that we had mentioned, not in this podcast, but talked about something that's interesting about this show is that Elizabeth is like the only openly queer character that we see. Because like we see her sleeping with women, we see her sleeping with men? We see her masturbating to a statue of Peter's father.
Oh, I forgot that happened. Oh boy, yeah.
And like she's truly wild when it comes to her sex life, but at the same time, like she knows how to channel her wildness.
What do you mean by that?
Like she knows where to put, like, because Peter, I think it could be argued that Elizabeth is just as wild as Peter, but Elizabeth knows where to keep it in a way that doesn't hurt people.
Oh, yeah, okay. I think that makes a big difference, is that Elizabeth does not have the same penchant for harm, or, as I would argue, the same enjoyment of harm that Peter does.
And she legitimately wants Catherine to be happy.
Yeah.
She and Catherine are legitimately friends.
Yeah, they get along with each other. So one thing actually that I've been rolling around in my brain.
Also,
Oh no,
side
go
note,
ahead.
Elizabeth would have slept with
Oh,
Catherine if
absolutely.
Catherine had said yes.
Absolutely. I mean, in that moment where she's like, I could make you come right now. And then there's like the dramatic pause, and she's like, well, do you want me to?
Shall I?
It's like, no, that's okay. That's all right. But I appreciate the advice. But something actually in that sequence. So after Catherine has her explosive orgasm in front of two guards, right? Going back to the voyeurism, accidental voyeurism. She has the explosive orgasm. She goes to Aunt Elizabeth for advice and for grounding. And
Mhm.
Elizabeth does mention that she learned this magical tongue trick from her tutor at 14.
And that she has like a love for the number 33.
Yeah, so
Like how 33 what?
girl, you know what? Why are you being coy? But
That's like a lot, man.
hey, Elizabeth out here living her best life. But I guess the question that arose in my mind is thinking about power, right? If we're thinking about the relationship between sex and power throughout the course of the Great, we have Elizabeth who kind of has these off stories about weird sexual power relationships that I don't know if they're. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is if they're supposed to be, if we're supposed to laugh at them and be like, oh, ha ha ha, Elizabeth, you've lived a crazy life, or if they're supposed to make us pause and think about, I don't know, how she got to this point in her life where she is, because, I mean, she slept with Peter's father, right?
When she was 17.
When she was 17.
When Peter was in
With
the
Peter
room.
in the room, which she didn't remember. Again, the voyeurism, it's back. We have this with her tutor when she was 14, right? So there's these weird kind of, I don't know, moments with people that have power over her, in which she's recalling the narratives positively, but I'm not 100% convinced that we're supposed to be reading them as unequivocally positive. Which I don't know. And this isn't a question that I have the capacity to answer right now on this podcast. But, you know, with her, I mean, we do have the mention of Archie perhaps being queer, right? Even though now as Archbishop, he doesn't do anything of the anything anymore, right?
Except get off on being tortured.
Yeah. But with Elizabeth, you know, as kind of our only active queer character, I don't know if that's a phrase, right? To also have her in these kind of troubling circumstances with men that are in power, I'm not quite sure how I'm supposed to come away from that. And it might be something worth unpacking in, like, not right now, I guess, but in thinking about the Great and thinking about the narrative, how she's handled.
Well, I think it's partially that the narrative doesn't want us to take these events that are happening at face value. It wants us to think about, like, when Georgie is sleeping with Peter, how much is it because she wants to?
Right.
How much of it is because Peter is good at sex? Which, I mean, I think is a small part of it. How much is it because that's her only avenue to power?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if we're thinking about George, I think it's all of those things.
Also, a side note, that actress is 39 and, like, she can still get it.
Excuse you? Just because you're in your 20s, like, we don't shrivel up and die when we're in our 30s. I'm going to fight you.
No, she's like 40. She's like...
To be fair, I hope I am that fabulous once I get to 40.
I mean, like, well, because, like, the actors who play Peter and Gregor are, like, a full-ass decade younger than her, which doesn't happen in Hollywood.
Yeah. Hold on. What is her real name? Charity Wakefield.
Charity Wakefield.
Oh, yeah. Look at her. 1980. Get it, girl. But also, I will fight you when this pandemic is over. Don't you ever look down on women in their 30s, okay? I'll beat you up.
I was just saying she's looking good.
I know. No, but she is gorgeous. Like, everybody in that cast is gorgeous.
But so if you think of George, but then also think of, like, well, like, how will George look? Or, like, what will her relationship to power be like in 20 or 30 years? And then obviously George isn't like on the throne or like in the royal family, but Elizabeth like at 17 versus Elizabeth at however old she's supposed to be now. Like she's from like the previous generation in a way,
Okay.
but like a younger part of the previous generation. So like she's like like where will these characters be in the next season?
Right.
Like
Right.
and Elizabeth is almost like a preview of that. Like when you've had this traumatic, almost lawless, chaotic upbringing that you have to like figure like
out how
she's
to
sort of
navigate.
she's found her equilibrium. And she's like figured out how to be happy, or where she can't be happy, at least be okay. Like with like trying to give heart to the soldiers,
Right.
but then like screaming into the forest on the way back. Like she's found what outlet she can,
Right,
and what avenues to power she can wield effectively.
yeah. Hearing you kind of talk in that way, Elizabeth almost feels like the most balanced character in the entire show. Because thinking,
it almost makes you agree with Archie that she should be Empress.
Yeah. I mean,
because like Catherine's not
no,
ready.
Absolutely not. Catherine's not ready. But also, that was actually a fun nod to real history in which she was Empress, and Peter's mother. So that's fun. But yeah. She is one of the most keeled characters, even though she is kind of our delightful butterfly agent of chaos, right? And she knows how to, I guess, find her peace, as you said. But yeah, George is also absolutely a fascinating character. I felt a lot of things for all of these characters throughout the narrative, but I felt particularly bad for her and Grigor. Grigor?
I don't know, man. I've said it, I think, both ways in the last 20 minutes.
There you go.
So.
The double G's, their relationship is very complex and sad, in that I think they both have this love for Peter, but then they also both kind of detest him at the same time. Yeah, they talking about the three of them could take up a podcast all its own. Yeah. Is there anything else pressing?
I don't think that. So there's nothing else I definitely want to bring up. Whoops. But I think maybe thinking about what sort of as like a concluding question, like what is it about this show that it does with sex and love that we think makes it like unique, and like why is it that we wanted to talk about it?
That's
for our very first episode.
That is a great question. Yeah, so I guess I'll jump on this first and then you can. So when you suggested watching The Great, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to feel about it. I don't watch too many historical dramas. I mean, I could stand to watch more, I suppose, because, The Favorite seems to be something that so many people love that maybe I can turn my attention towards it. But something that stood out to me about The Great was how much it seemed to enjoy being told. All right, let me rephrase that. Like, the people who were involved in this project really wanted to tell this story, and they were taking what they were doing seriously, but there's kind of a joy in how the narrative comes together. And I think the kind of strange dichotomies of sex, love, relationships, duty, how that all kind of is rolled together in looking at these characters is absolutely fascinating. Like, actually, that reminds me of something. So episode 4, right, opens with a juxtaposition of two sex scenes. which I
Mhm.
think for me encapsulates what's interesting about The Great. The first one we have is with Catherine and Leo, and it's passionate, and they're both in the sequence, and they're rolling all around and loving on each other, and the light is soft, and it's like got all these nice yellows, and everyone looks all beautiful. And then they cut directly from that to uh, Peter and George in bed, and George is talking about her father being dead or when her father died. And Peter's just looking at his thumb and he's like, "Doesn't my thumb look like a bear? It smells like you." So it's like this very dramatic juxtaposition of,
Mhm.
I don't know, not, I mean, just of different kinds of sexual relationships. One we're clearly supposed to be in favor of, and the other one we're clearly supposed to have qualms about, right? They're manipulating us
Mhm.
in that way. But I still think it's just really interesting to look at how these relationships unfold and how they develop in this weird kind of microcosm of this rendition of the Russian court. What about you?
Mhm. So the thing that I found, the tone I think is just generally hilarious. Um, but I think the way that Catherine starts from a place of complete naivete and like romanticizing
Mm,
sex to even like her self-awareness that she gains over the course of the show, which I think does map pretty clearly onto her relationship with sex
mhm,
and with love and with power. That like she
mm,
starts from this, like it would have been so easy at the beginning for Peter if he had cared about Catherine even a little bit to make her fall deeply in love with him
mhm.
and never even become a
Yeah.
threat. But then that we see her learn what sex is, what romantic love is, but then also like what love for power is.
Mm.
And even though I still stand by what I said that Catherine is not like a purely good
No,
character.
I
Like we're not
agree.
supposed to see her that
Yeah.
way. But the show
I mean,
also
it's still a
doesn't
text.
like it doesn't condemn her at the end for choosing Russia over choosing Leo.
Mm,
And to see like a woman be able to like when like she's right when she tells Peter that she'd be better and she is
mhm,
better.
mhm.
That's true. Um
In this narrative, yeah.
so
Yeah.
in this narrative in this
In this
version,
version.
um but like seeing that arc from like not everything being theoretical to like to like a lived reality
Mhm.
to her and her to gain the experience and understanding to take power, albeit still in a kind of naive way, but in a much more real way.
Mm.
That like when she's walking through like the halls of the court after she's called off the coup and sees the way that people are looking at her
Mhm.
and then decides that
Yeah, this is
okay,
what I'm
yeah,
gonna
this
do.
is like I have to choose
Yeah.
this even though it will hurt me terribly
Mhm.
and results in Leo's death. I think seeing the arc from how she gets from where she was to where she is at the end is really, really
Yeah.
compelling.
No, excellent. Well said, my dear. Well said. Huzzah! Huzzah! Huzzah!
Huzzah!
Indeed.
Indeed.
Well, I think on that note, we can wrap up our first episode of Sex, Love, Literature. I hope you had fun chatting with us, or
Mm-hmm.
I guess they didn't really chat with us, listening to us chat and giggle, like the schoolgirls we are, I suppose. Um,
But if you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to find us on Instagram or on Twitter. We'd love to continue talking about the great some
Yeah,
more.
and you can find us on both of those platforms at Sex Love Lit, all one word. But don't stop searching after Sex Love. There's things that come up, so type it all in. Sex Love Lit in Twitter or in Instagram. It's been a delight. This was a lot of fun. I can't wait to do this again. Indeed.
Yes.
Huzzah.
Huzzah.
Yeah, and we look forward to talking to you guys next time. This has been Sex, Love, Literature with two sex nerds.